The blood hit the floor before anyone moved. A special operations soldier lay open on the trauma table at Blackridge Regional Hospital, a bullet sitting 3 millimeters from his heart, and the only surgeon on call was stuck behind a 4-car pileup on Route 9, 22 minutes out. The monitors were screaming. The room was paralyzed. 8 trained medical professionals stood frozen, watching a man die in slow motion, and not one of them reached for a blade, except the nurse they'd spent 6 months ignoring. 29-year-old Mara Voss, quiet, unremarkable, assigned to general intake, stepped through the circle of useless bodies, looked at the chest X-ray on the screen, and said 4 words nobody in that room expected. "I'm going in. Move." Nobody moved. So she moved them. If you're watching this right now, stay until the end. This story will take you somewhere you didn't expect. Like and subscribe if you want to follow Mara's journey, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. The morning shift at Blackridge Regional had started the way it always started, with too many patients, not enough beds, and Dr. Raymond Holt circling the nursing station like a man who believed the laws of physics bent around his schedule. "Carter, Carter," he stopped himself, snapping his fingers in the direction of the desk without looking up from his tablet. "Not Carter. The new one. Voss." Mara looked up from a medication log she was already behind on. "Yes, Dr. Holt. Bed 7 needs a line redone. Your work from last night, it's positional." It wasn't positional. She'd checked it twice. The patient had moved in his sleep and kinked the tubing, which was something any second-year resident could have diagnosed without making it somebody's fault. But Mara said nothing, wrote nothing on her face, and walked to bed 7. She'd been at Blackridge Regional for 6 months, 3 weeks, and 4 days. Not that she was counting toward anything specific. She'd taken the position because it was available, because the hospital was 40 minutes from her sister's place in Dunmore, and because she needed to be somewhere ordinary for a while, somewhere that didn't require her to carry a weapon. The position hadn't delivered on ordinary exactly, but it had delivered on something close enough. Blackridge served a mid-sized community in the western corridor of Harlow County, a place that had been economically stressed long enough that it had started to look like that was just its natural condition. The hospital ran short-staffed on a good week. The equipment in Trauma Bay 2 had been scheduled for upgrade for 8 months and counting. The break room coffee maker had been broken since February, and management kept sending emails about it instead of just buying a new one. Mara fit into this environment the way a bolt fits into a mismatched thread, technically functional, never quite right. She wasn't rude. She wasn't careless. Her patient outcomes were clean, her charting was meticulous, and she had the kind of muscle memory in a trauma setting that made newer nurses watch her hands when they thought she wasn't looking. But she didn't explain herself well. She didn't smile reflexively. She answered direct questions directly, which in a social ecosystem like a hospital nursing floor sometimes read as arrogance or coldness, or simply something that made people uncomfortable without being able to say exactly why. Dr. Holt had made up his mind about her in the first week. She could tell by the way he addressed the air near her head rather than her face, the way he rerouted simple questions to other nurses even when she was standing 2 feet away. Her supervisor, charge nurse Dina Pratt, was more complicated. Dina was 20 years in, efficient, and fair to a point, but she ran her floor with a specific social order and Mara hadn't slotted into it correctly. There had been one conversation early on where Dina had sat across from her in the break room and said, with genuine curiosity rather than malice, "Where were you before this? Your application said urgent care, but you don't move like urgent care." "Various places," Mara had said, which wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the kind of answer that invited follow-up, and Dina, to her credit, hadn't pushed. But the question had left a residue. Various places covered a lot of ground, and Dina was experienced enough to feel the shape of something she wasn't being told. The shift continued. Mara replaced the IV tubing on bed 7, rerouted an admission from the ER that had been miscategorized, helped a 63-year-old man named Walter through a panic attack that 2 other nurses had logged as cardiac and were preparing to escalate unnecessarily. Walter was grateful in the way old men sometimes are, quietly, with steadiness, and he said, You knew it wasn't my heart. And she said, your pressure was fine. You just needed to breathe. And he said, nobody told me that. And she said, I know. That was the whole conversation. It was enough. By 11:40, the morning had thinned into the dead zone between the breakfast rush and the lunch crowd, and Mara was updating charts at the station when the radio crackled. EMS patch, incoming trauma. GSW to the thoracic region, single entry wound, unstable vitals, ETA 6 minutes. The standard choreography began. Dina called the trauma team. Someone paged Dr. Holt. Someone else began staging the bay. Mara set down her pen and moved toward Trauma Bay 1 without being told, because that was what you did, and because the specific combination of words, thoracic, unstable, had sharpened something in her that was very old and very quiet and not entirely civilian. The paramedics came through the doors at 11:47 with a man on a gurney who was the color of old wax. Early 30s, built like someone who used their body for work rather than appearance, wearing clothes that told Mara several things before anyone spoke. The tactical fabric, the specific wear pattern on the knees, the kind of hands that came from weight-bearing in difficult terrain. GSW, right thoracic, entry here, no exit, the lead paramedic said, pointing. Pressure's been dropping since pickup. We've been pushing fluids, but he's bleeding into the chest, Mara said. Not as a question. The paramedic looked at her. That's what it looks like. Dr. Holt arrived 40 seconds later, assessed the situation, and got on the phone with the surgical team. The surgical team was 22 minutes out. Dr. Holt looked at the monitor. He looked at the patient. He ordered more fluids. Mara stood at the foot of the bed and watched the oxygen saturation drop another 2 points. He needs a chest opened, she said. Holt didn't look up. We're not there yet. His SAT is 89 and dropping. His pressure, I see his pressure, Voss. If we wait for surgery, he won't have enough. That's enough. Holt said it with the particular sharpness of a man who was embarrassed in front of a room and defaulting to authority because he didn't have a better answer. You manage your lane. Let me manage mine. Mara closed her mouth. She looked at the monitor. She looked at the patient's face. The particular looseness of a person sliding from consciousness into somewhere worse. And she felt the clock the way she'd learned to feel it years ago, in places that no longer existed in any official record. The surgical team was 22 minutes out. The patient had maybe 7. She did the math. She'd done this math before, in worse rooms, with worse light and no backup at all, and the math had never changed. Dina appeared at her shoulder. Voss? Patient in 4 is asking for, in a minute, Mara said. Not sharp, just absolute. Dina looked at her. On the monitor, the saturation hit 87. Holt was on the phone. The 2 residents in the room were watching the monitor with the specific paralysis of people who knew something was wrong but had learned, through institutional training, that waiting for someone above them to make the call was the correct professional behavior. One of the nurses, a young man named Terrell, who'd been at Blackridge 8 months longer than Mara and was clearly good at the job, was watching her with an expression she recognized, the expression of someone who agreed with her but wasn't in a position to say so. The saturation hit 86. Mara moved. She didn't announce it. She didn't ask for permission. She pulled the crash cart to position, snapped gloves on with the efficiency of someone who had done this without gloves before and therefore found gloves an easy luxury, and she looked at Terrell and said very quietly, I need you with me. Terrell said, What are you? Right here. With me. Now. He moved. What the hell? Holt turned from the phone. Voss, step back. He's at 85 and still going down. The hemothorax is compressing his heart. If we don't decompress now, he dies before the surgeon walks through the door. You are a floor nurse. You do not perform thoracic procedures. I've performed thoracic procedures. She said it plainly, without defiance, the way someone states a fact about their past that they're not particularly interested in discussing. He needs a thoracotomy. I need 30 seconds of your trust, or I need you to step aside. The room was completely still. The monitor beeped. 84. Holt stared at her with the expression of a man who had been professionally insulted and physically could not process the situation fast enough to respond usefully. The patient's blood pressure read 74/40. Mara had already made her decision. She'd made it, if she was being honest, about 40 seconds earlier. She was simply completing the steps in the right order. Terrell, she said, betadine thoracotomy tray. Terrell, to his permanent credit, moved without waiting for Holt to object again. What happened in the next 4 minutes was not smooth. It wasn't the kind of thing that looks clean in a teaching video. Mara's hands were certain, but the patient was unstable. The lighting in Bay 1 had been unreliable for 3 months, and the thoracotomy tray they'd been issued was the older configuration she hadn't worked with in a while. There was a moment, brief, honest, where her first retractor placement wasn't where she wanted it, and she had to adjust. And Terrell read her without being told and adjusted his angle of assistance. And between the two of them, they found the working rhythm that the situation required. She located the projectile by feel and by the trail of damage it had left, a copper-jacketed round that had deflected off a rib and traveled in a direction no one with a nice clean shooting diagram would have predicted. It was sitting 2 millimeters, not 3. 2. She could see the range was worse than the paramedics had measured. From the pericardium, and the tamponade that was developing around the heart was exactly what she'd suspected. She decompressed the tamponade first. The patient's pressure climbed. Barely, but it climbed. She removed the round with the specific care of someone who knew what the pericardium looked like when it was about to rupture because she had seen it rupture once in a forward operating base that no longer officially existed, and she had learned from that what you cannot learn in a classroom. The monitor shifted. The saturation climbed. Holt said nothing. Terrell exhaled through his nose, quietly, and did not look at anyone else in the room. The surgical team arrived 19 minutes later. Dr. Andrea Foss, the senior trauma surgeon, walked into Bay 1 and stopped in the doorway, reading the room in the way experienced surgeons do, absorbing the data that the equipment and the personnel positions tell you before anyone opens their mouth. She looked at the patient, who was now intubated and stabilized. She looked at the open thoracotomy field. She looked at Mara, who was completing a suture closure, and said, "What happened?" "Hemothorax with early tamponade," Mara said. "Bullet was 2 millimeters from the pericardium. I decompressed and removed. Vitals stabilized at approximately 12:15. He's going to need a surgical review of the right lower lobe, but the immediate threat is addressed." Foss looked at the monitor, at the readings, at the repair work. She nodded once, slowly. "Good call," she said. It was the most neutral 2-word response possible, and it still felt, briefly, like something. Dr. Holt was no longer in the room. The conversation with Dina happened in the hallway outside Bay 1, with the door still open and Terrell visible inside, keeping watch over the patient. "You understand what you did," Dina said. It wasn't a question. "I understand what I did. You performed an unauthorized invasive surgical procedure. You ignored a direct instruction from the attending physician. You took the thoracotomy tray without clearance." Mara looked at her. "He's alive." "I know he's alive." Dina's voice didn't have satisfaction in it, or anger exactly. It had the sound of a person who understood the situation clearly and did not like any of the available options. "That's the only reason we're having this conversation in a hallway instead of in front of HR. But you have to understand." "Dina," Mara said it gently, because she genuinely liked Dina in the way she liked competent people who operated with integrity in broken systems. "If I had waited, he would have died. You and I both know that. You can be angry at how I did it. You can write it up. Whatever the process is, I'll do it. But I'm not going to apologize for the outcome." Dina studied her for a long moment. "You've done this before," she said. Mara said nothing. "Not in a hospital," Dina said. Still nothing. Dina looked down at the floor, pressed her lips together. "Go finish your charts. I'll call you when they're ready to discuss it formally." Mara went back to her charts. The formal discussion came at 2:30 in the afternoon, in a conference room on the administrative floor, and it was already clear when Mara walked in that the outcome had been decided before she sat down. Hospital Director Glenn Marsh was at the head of the table, a man who had the particular energy of someone who had spent 20 years moving up an institutional ladder without ever having to make a decision that cost him anything personally. Dr. Holt was there. Legal was there. Dina was there, in the corner, with an expression that said she'd argued something and lost. Marsh didn't waste time. What you did today was reckless, insubordinate, and a significant liability to this institution, he said. Regardless of the patient outcome. The patient is alive, Mara said. Regardless, Marsh continued louder. You performed a procedure you are not credentialed to perform in direct violation of physician orders. That's not something this hospital can absorb. I have performed thoracic field procedures under... You're a floor nurse, Ms. Voss, with a 2-year gap in your employment history that you've declined to explain, a pattern of not working well within the team structure here, and now this. He folded his hands on the table. I'm terminating your employment, effective immediately. Security will escort you to collect your belongings. The room was quiet. Mara looked at Holt, who was examining the table. She looked at Marsh, who was looking at her with the composed expression of a man who had done this before and found it uncomplicated. She looked at Dina, who was looking at something just past Mara's left shoulder. Okay, Mara said. Just that. She stood up. She didn't say anything else. There was nothing to say. And the particular quiet fury that had been building in her chest since the meeting started was the kind she knew how to contain. She'd contained it in worse rooms, in front of worse people, when the stakes were considerably higher than this. It was a muscle, like any other, and it held. Security, a man named Dwight, who'd always been decent to her, walked her to the locker room and waited outside while she changed out of her scrubs, then walked her to the nursing station to collect the small set of personal items that had accumulated in her drawer over 6 months. A phone charger, a paperback with a cracked spine, a photograph she'd kept face down most of the time, which she turned face up for a moment before sliding it into the box. Her and her brother, somewhere cold, maybe 6 years ago, before things had changed. She put the photo in the box. She picked up the box. She walked toward the elevator. Terrell appeared at the edge of the station. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her with an expression of controlled anger that said everything there was to say about institutional injustice and the math of power, and she gave him a very small nod. The kind that meant, I know, and it's okay, and thank you, and kept walking. The elevator came. She rode down to the lobby. The lobby of Black Ridge Regional was mid-afternoon quiet. A few people in the waiting area, a woman at the information desk. The ambient noise of a building going about its ordinary business. Mara crossed the lobby toward the exit, her box under her arm, thinking about the 40-minute drive to Dunmore and whether her sister would be home and what exactly she was going to say, which was not a conversation she was looking forward to at all. She was 8 feet from the front door when the building shook. Not an explosion. Something else. A bass-frequency concussion from above, repeated, rhythmic, that she felt in her sternum before she consciously identified it. Rotor wash? A helicopter. Multiple helicopters, actually, arriving fast and hard onto the hospital's rooftop landing pad with the kind of controlled urgency that wasn't a civilian medevac. Civilian medevac came in slow and procedural. This came in the way she remembered from other contexts, purposeful and loud and completely indifferent to civilian social choreography. The lobby doors burst open. Personnel in military utility uniforms streamed through, 4, 6, 8 of them, moving in the systematic pattern of people who had trained for exactly this kind of entry and were not making it up as they went. They were armed, sidearms holstered but visible, and they spread through the lobby with a controlled efficiency that immediately changed the atmospheric pressure of the room. Behind them walked a man who didn't need an introduction, though most of the people in the lobby didn't know that yet. Mara knew. She stopped walking. She'd seen that posture in a specific context years ago, across a tactical table in a forward position that didn't exist on any official map. She'd seen those particular insignia in a classified briefing document she wasn't supposed to have retained enough to recall, but her memory had never been the sort she could selectively edit. Admiral Nathan Pierce, Deputy Chief of Naval Operations, decorated across 3 conflicts, the kind of rank that didn't show up in regional hospitals in mid-sized counties without a very specific reason. He came through the lobby doors and stopped, reading the room with the same rapid data absorption that Dr. Foss had done in the trauma bay. Different information, same efficiency. And then he looked at the duty desk and said, In a voice that was quiet and absolute and expected to be obeyed. "Who's the administrator on duty?" The desk assistant said. I can page." "Do that," Pierce said. He turned and said something to the man immediately behind him, a younger officer whose expression had the specific controlled tension of someone managing a personal emergency through professional discipline. Then he turned again, and his eyes moved across the lobby and stopped. On Mara. The recognition was mutual and immediate. Pierce looked at her for a moment, at the box under her arm, at the civilian clothes, at the particular way she was standing, which was not quite the way someone stands when they're just passing through. And he said nothing yet because he was reading, and Mara stood still and let him read. "Boss?" he said finally. It wasn't a question. "Admiral?" she said. He looked at the box. "Tell me that box means what I think it means." The lobby was very quiet. Everyone who had been doing other things had, with the social gravity of a dozen armed military personnel having arrived, gradually oriented toward what was happening near the entrance. Glenn Marsh appeared from the administrative corridor, slightly out of breath, with the expression of a man who had been interrupted mid-afternoon and was composing his authority face on the walk over. He stopped when he saw Pierce. He saw the insignia and did the calculation that people do when they suddenly understand the scale of what they're dealing with. "Admiral Pierce," he said, extending a hand. "Glenn Marsh, hospital director. I wasn't informed." "You wouldn't have been," Pierce said. He didn't take the hand. He was still looking at Mara. "I got a call 20 minutes ago. One of my people came through your trauma bay this morning, GSW, thoracic." Marsh nodded. "Yes, we were very sorry to hear. Your nephew, I understand." "He's going to be fine," Pierce said. "According to the surgeon I just spoke with, because of a field thoracotomy that was performed by a nurse before the surgical team arrived." He paused. "A nurse who, from what I can see, is currently holding a box of personal items in the lobby of your hospital." Marsh's composure flickered, barely. "There were circumstances, a protocol violation. What's her name?" Marsh blinked. "I'm sorry?" "The nurse," Pierce said. "Who saved my nephew's life? What's her name?" The lobby was absolutely still. Everyone was looking at Marsh, then at Mara, then back. Marsh said slowly, "Mara Voss. But as I said, there were—" "I know exactly who Mara Voss is," Pierce said, and the way he said it, the particular weight in those 7 words, made several people in the room understand without being told that the afternoon had taken a turn that Glenn Marsh had not planned for and could not redirect. Mara stood with her box and said nothing, watching Pierce's face, reading what was behind it. Anger, yes. Control over the anger, yes. And something else. The particular expression of a man who has just connected 2 pieces of information that produce a picture he's trying to decide how to handle. She'd seen that expression before, too. The last time she'd seen it was on a tarmac 4 years ago, in the dark, in a country she had never officially been in, immediately before everything had gone sideways in a way that had ended her military career and begun whatever this was. Whatever this was. Pierce stepped toward Marsh with the slow, deliberate movement of someone who was not in a hurry because they did not need to be. "Mr. Marsh," he said, "I think you and I need to have a conversation, and I think Ms. Voss should be present for it." Marsh glanced at Mara, at the box, at the lobby full of military personnel, and the afternoon that was turning into something he hadn't anticipated. "Of course," he said. His composure was professional, intact, and paper-thin. Pierce turned to Mara, and his expression shifted into something slightly less official. Not warm, exactly, but direct. Honest. The expression of a person talking to someone they know rather than someone they're managing. "Set the box down," he said. "You're not going anywhere yet." Mara set the box on the nearest chair. She didn't know, standing there in the lobby of a hospital that had just fired her, what exactly came next. She had guesses. She had enough information from Pierce's presence and the controlled velocity of his arrival and the specific way he'd said, "I know exactly who Mara Voss is," to form a shape in her mind of where this was going. But shapes weren't certainties, and she'd learned a long time ago not to assume that the direction a thing was moving was the direction it would arrive. What she knew was this. The man whose life she'd saved this morning was Pierce's nephew, and Pierce had said he knew who she was, which meant he knew who she'd been. And whatever he knew, whatever connection existed between the woman she used to be and the afternoon that was unfolding in this lobby, it was going to come out now, in this building, in front of people who had no idea what they were about to hear. Mara looked at Glenn Marsh, who was straightening his jacket with the specific composure of a man who had just realized he was standing on unstable ground but hadn't yet figured out exactly where the edge was. She thought about the conference room upstairs, about the folded hands on the table, about regardless of the patient outcome. She thought about the patient, alive in the ICU. She thought about the photograph in the box. Her brother, somewhere cold, 6 years ago. She picked up the box. She held it, and she waited. She held it, and she waited. And the conference room they walked her into 20 minutes later was the same one she'd been fired in 2 hours earlier, which struck her as either ironic or just efficient, depending on how you felt about institutional spaces. Pierce sat across from Marsh this time, which rearranged the geometry of the room in ways that mattered. Marsh had taken the head of the table this morning because it was his hospital, and he'd wanted her to feel the architecture of that. Now Pierce sat at the head without asking, without announcing it, without any visible awareness that he was doing anything at all. It was simply where he sat, because he was the most senior person in any room he walked into, and his body knew it without requiring confirmation. Marsh ended up to Pierce's left. Mara ended up to his right, her box on the floor beside her chair, her hands on the table. 2 of Pierce's officers stood near the door, not blocking it, just present. Legal had melted away somewhere between the lobby and the elevator. Dina wasn't here. Holt wasn't here. "Walk me through this morning," Pierce said. He was addressing Mara, not Marsh. She did. She walked him through it the way she'd been trained to brief, sequentially, without editorializing, with the relevant clinical data attached to each decision point, the drop in saturation, the timeline on the surgical team, the specific presentation of the hemothorax and the probability calculus she'd run in real time. Pierce listened without interrupting. He had the quality that she associated with effective commanders, the ability to receive information without reacting to it until the information was complete. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "And at what point did Dr. Holt tell you to stand down?" "Before I opened the chest." "And you did it anyway." "He was going to die," Mara said. "I made a judgment call." Pierce nodded. Not approvingly, not disapprovingly, just taking the data. Marsh said, "Which is exactly the problem. A nurse making that kind of—" "Mr. Marsh," Pierce said without raising his voice. "I'll get to you." Marsh closed his mouth. Pierce looked at Mara with an expression that had something uncomfortable in it. Not hostility, but weight. The weight of someone who knew a version of her that this room did not, and who was deciding, in real time, how much of that version to surface. "I'm going to need your file," he said. "My hospital file?" Mara said. "Your other file." The room was quiet. Marsh looked between them. "I'm sorry. What other file?" Neither of them answered him. The other file took 40 minutes to arrive, transmitted through channels that required 2 separate clearance verifications and a satellite relay that Mara was fairly certain the hospital's IT infrastructure had never hosted before. One of Pierce's officers set up the equipment in a small office adjacent to the conference room, and Pierce reviewed it there alone for about 12 minutes, while Mara waited in the hallway with the box on her lap and a cup of bad vending machine coffee that Dwight had appeared with from somewhere, silently, in the way that decent people sometimes perform small kindnesses in the middle of complicated situations. She appreciated it more than she could have explained. The hallway had a window that looked out over the hospital's rear parking lot, and beyond that, the edge of the county's tree line, scrubby second-growth hardwoods that had come back after the old mill operations shut down, patchy and irregular, not quite wilderness, but not quite anything else either. Mara looked at it and drank the coffee and thought about nothing specific, which was a skill she'd developed and maintained with some effort. Pierce came back out after 12 minutes. He stood in the hallway for a moment, looking at her. 7 confirmed surgical interventions in active combat conditions, he said, 4 of which were thoracic, 2 of which were— He stopped. Where exactly were you trained? It wasn't formal training, she said. Not officially. He said nothing, waiting. You deploy with a unit long enough, under the right circumstances, you learn what you have to learn. She turned the coffee cup in her hands. I had good teachers. You were attached to Colonel Hargreaves' unit. It wasn't a question, so she didn't answer it as one. She just looked at him. I know what that unit did, Pierce said quietly. I know what the conditions were. Then you know why the record looks the way it looks. He did. She could see it. There was a particular kind of institutional silence that followed military operations that had been classified and then buried and then quietly never discussed again. And Mara had lived inside that silence for 4 years. Her discharge had been honorable on paper, but hollow in every way that mattered. No recognition, no official acknowledgement of what she'd done or seen, a service record that had been carefully edited to remove the parts that would have required explaining. She'd taken a job in urgent care in a city she didn't know anyone in, and she'd worked through it, or tried to. Why Blackridge? Pierce asked. My sister's in Dunmore. That's it? That's it. She finished the coffee. I wasn't planning a career move, I was just trying to stay somewhere for a while. Pierce nodded slowly, then he said, He's my nephew, Marcus, my sister's youngest. He said it without decoration, the way someone states a fact that has personal significance but doesn't require an audience. He came back from his 3rd deployment with a commendation and a bullet in his chest, and if you hadn't been in that trauma bay this morning, I was, she said. That's all. That's not all. Pierce said it with more force than he'd used for anything else in the last hour. Mara, you were fired, in front of your colleagues, by a man who didn't know what he was looking at. And you want to call that's all? She looked at him. What do you want me to say? I want you to understand that what happened to you this afternoon isn't something I'm going to let sit. She studied him. His expression was controlled, but there was something underneath it that she recognized. The same specific anger she'd seen on other people's faces when they encountered institutional injustice and had enough standing to do something about it. It was different from impotent outrage. It had shape and direction. What are you planning? She asked. I'm planning to walk back into that conference room and have a very detailed conversation with Glenn Marsh about this afternoon's sequence of events. He paused. And I need you there for it. Mara stood up. She put the empty coffee cup on the windowsill. She looked out at the parking lot for a moment, at the patchy tree line, at the ordinary late afternoon light on ordinary things. Okay, she said. You keep saying that, he said. Just okay. It's what I've got right now. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. Okay, the conference room reconvened at 4:15, and it was different now in every way that mattered. Marsh had made calls in the interval. Mara could tell by the quality of his composure, which had been recalibrated toward something more lawyerly. A man from the hospital's legal office had materialized in a chair along the wall with a notepad he was using to demonstrate attentiveness. Dr. Holt was back, which surprised her, though she kept that off her face. Holt looked like a man who had been told something he didn't like and was managing his response to it with mixed success. Pierce was direct. Mr. Marsh, I've reviewed Miss Voss's service record as it pertains to this morning's events, he said. She performed a life-saving procedure under time pressure in the absence of surgical capability, consistent with training and experience that your hospital wasn't aware she had. That's not a protocol violation. That's a system gap. Admiral, with respect, Marsh began. She also, Pierce continued, was given a direct instruction by the attending physician to stand down. I'm not ignoring that. What I am noting is that the attending physician's instruction would have resulted in a patient death, which is a different kind of problem. Holt said nothing. His jaw was tight. The termination, Pierce said, is going to be reviewed. Marsh's composure held, but the edges of it were visible. That's an internal personnel matter. It's a personnel matter that I have a direct interest in, given that the personnel in question saved the life of an active military officer this morning. Pierce's voice had an even, measured quality that was somehow more arresting than volume. I'm not telling you what to do with your hospital. I'm telling you that I'm going to be paying attention to what you do. The legal man along the wall wrote something on his notepad. Marsh looked at Mara, and she saw it. A flicker of recalibration, the specific look of a man deciding whether the position he'd taken this afternoon was one he still wanted to hold. He'd fired her because he could, because she'd been insubordinate and he'd wanted to make a point, and the math had seemed simple. The math was no longer simple. "We can discuss a review process," Marsh said, finally. "Good," Pierce said. "We'll do that." He stood up. "Tonight, I'm going to be with my nephew. Tomorrow, someone from my office will be in contact." He looked at Mara. "Ms. Voss, you're still on hospital grounds." "My car's in the parking lot," she said. "Don't go anywhere." She nodded. Pierce left with two of his officers. The room underwent the rapid temperature drop that rooms undergo when the most powerful person in them exits. Marsh sat with his hands folded on the table, looking at nothing in particular, doing the math she could almost see him doing. Holt got up without looking at her and walked out. Mara picked up her box. Dina appeared in the doorway. She'd been there for some part of it, Mara realized, had been listening from the threshold. And their eyes met briefly. Dina's expression was complicated in a way that Mara didn't have the energy to fully decode right now. There was something apologetic in it, and something that might have been respect, and something else that was just the ordinary sadness of a person who works inside a system and sees clearly what the system does to people and doesn't know what to do with that clarity. "There's a waiting room on the 3rd floor that's usually empty," Dina said. "If you need somewhere to sit." "Thank you," Mara said. She meant it. But the 3rd floor waiting room was empty, as advertised. It had a row of plastic chairs and a window, and a television mounted to the wall that someone had left on a local news channel with the volume low. Mara sat down, put her box on the adjacent chair, and looked out the window at the afternoon becoming early evening, the light thickening and going orange over the parking lot. She called her sister, Petra, because she owed her a call, and because Petra was the kind of person who would hear something in Mara's voice whether Mara mentioned it or not, and it was better to control the conversation than to be ambushed by Petra's perception. "Hey," Petra answered, "you're off early." "Little bit." "That's not your little bit voice." "What happened?" Mara closed her eyes. "Had a complicated day." "Complicated like interesting complicated, or complicated like you need me to drive over?" "First one, maybe second one. I'll know in an hour." Petra was quiet for a moment with the specific quality of a person who is exercising restraint. "Are you okay?" "I'm not injured," Mara said. "That's the most accurate version of yes I have right now." "Mara, there was a patient, GSW. The surgeon wasn't there. I made a call." The silence on Petra's end had a different texture now. Petra knew enough, not everything, but enough, to understand what that sentence meant coming from Mara. "And," Petra said quietly, "he's alive. I'm in a waiting room on the 3rd floor." She paused. "They fired me." "They—" Petra stopped, started again. "They fired you for saving someone's life. There were other factors." "Mara, Petra, I'm okay. Some things are happening that I need to stay for. I'll call you when I know more." Petra said a few more things, and Mara said the minimum necessary to be reassuring without lying, and they hung up, and the waiting room was quiet again with just the low murmur of the television and the specific silence of a hospital floor that had settled into evening routine. She was on her 2nd hour in the chair when her phone buzzed. Unknown number, which meant Pierce's office, because Pierce's office operated on a number pool that wasn't in any civilian directory. "Voss? Ms. Voss?" Not Pierce, one of his officers, a woman with a clipped efficiency in her voice. "The Admiral asked me to update you. He's with his nephew. The patient is stable and responsive. He's asking about you." "Marcus?" "He's asking who the nurse was, the one who opened his chest." Mara said nothing. "The Admiral thought you'd want to know." "Thank you," she said. She put the phone down. Outside the window, the parking lot lights had come on. The sky was that specific blue that comes just after the sun goes below the tree line. Not dark yet, not light. Something in between with no good name for it. She thought about Marcus, a man she didn't know, whose face she'd barely registered because she'd been looking at the wound, the monitor, the specific millimeters between a bullet and a heart. 30-something, the build of someone who'd been in the field. Third deployment, Pierce had said. Commendation. She hoped he was uncomfortable, not in a cruel way, just in the way that meant alive, responding, with the awareness of someone who'd come close to something and would spend a few days metabolizing it. That was what alive looked like in the first 24 hours after an event like this. She knew that from more angles than she preferred. At 6:40 in the evening, the building changed. It wasn't an alarm, not at first. It was a sound from the floor below, a kind of rapid percussion of footsteps, multiple, too fast for routine, followed by the brief one-note burst of a radio that had been keyed and then cut off. Then a voice from the hallway outside the waiting room, one of Pierce's officers, moving at something faster than a walk. Mara was on her feet before she consciously processed why. She put her phone in her pocket and her box on the floor and went to the door. The corridor was active in a way that had shifted from the steady current of a hospital evening into something with edge. One of Pierce's people was coming from the direction of the stairwell, a young officer whose name she didn't know, maybe 26, moving with the controlled speed of someone responding to a specific situation rather than an alarm. "What happened?" she said. He looked at her, calculating something. "Stay here, ma'am." She fell in beside him instead. "What happened?" He made a decision. Someone accessed the ICU, not staff. Security found a door to the service corridor open on the second floor, adjacent to the south wing. "Which direction is the ICU from here?" "South wing, third floor. We're on—" He stopped. "You're on the third floor. The ICU is down that corridor." They both looked down the corridor at the same time. The door at the far end, the one that led to the clinical wing, the one that required a badge for after-hours access, was open. It should not have been open. Mara walked toward it. "Ms. Voss," she was already through it. The clinical corridor was different from the waiting area. Institutional white, lower ceilings, the smell of antiseptic and recycled air. Mostly quiet, with the background ambiance of monitoring equipment. A few staff at the nurses' station mid-corridor, one of whom looked up as Mara came through and then looked past her at the officer following. "ICU," Mara said to the nurse. "Has anyone gone through who shouldn't have?" The nurse, a young man, maybe 23, with the slightly stunned look of someone whose shift had recently become more than he'd signed up for, said, "There was a man, maybe 10 minutes ago. Said he was from facilities, but I didn't see a badge." "What did he look like?" "Medium height, dark jacket. He went," the nurse pointed, "toward the south end of the corridor, toward the ICU. The officer behind Mara was already on his radio. She was already walking." The ICU at Blackridge Regional was a 12-bed unit, currently holding 7 patients. Marcus was in bed 4. Mara knew this because Pierce's officer had mentioned it in passing earlier, and she'd noted it the way she noted everything, automatically, without particular effort, in the way that certain kinds of training arranged the mind. She came through the ICU entrance and read the room in 2 seconds. 6 of the 7 beds visible, all with appropriate monitoring, all with normal rhythms on the screens above. Staff nurse at the central station, on the phone, with an expression of careful neutrality that was slightly too careful. The expression of someone who didn't want to indicate that something was happening in case acknowledging it made it real. Bed 4 was at the far end of the unit, partially screened by a privacy curtain. The curtain was not the way she'd have positioned it. She moved toward it. The man was at the bedside, dark jacket, medium height. He was leaning over the bed with his back to her, doing something with the IV line. Not checking it, not adjusting it in the way a staff member would. Something else. Something with the specific focus of someone who had a task and was trying to complete it quickly. "Step back from the bed," Mara said. The man went still. Not the stillness of someone startled, the stillness of someone who'd been trained to go still when caught. He turned. He was maybe 45, with a face that had the particular quality of someone who'd spent time outdoors in severe conditions, weathered around the eyes, economical, not notable in any way that would help you describe him later. He was holding something in his right hand that he was in the process of sliding into the pocket of his jacket, but he hadn't finished the motion. A small capped syringe. Mara looked at the syringe. She looked at his face. She looked at the IV line that he'd been working on. "Put it down," she said. He said nothing. The ICU nurse had seen them now and was already moving for the emergency call button. The officer from the corridor came through the ICU entrance behind Mara. The man glanced past Mara at the officer, made a rapid calculation, and moved, not toward the exit, toward the wall panel beside Marcus's bed. There was a medical gas connection there, O2 and vacuum, standard ICU configuration. He got his hand on the oxygen valve. "Back off," he said. His voice was level. Whatever he felt about the situation, he wasn't feeling it in his voice. "Back off, or I open this." Mara stopped. The officer behind her stopped. The O2 valve was not a weapon in any conventional sense. But ICU patients on supplemental oxygen with compromised respiratory status had a very different relationship to disrupted O2 supply than healthy people did. And the valve was connected to the hospital's main oxygen system, which fed multiple rooms. "Who are you?" she said. He didn't answer. "What's in the syringe?" Still nothing. She read him the way she'd learned to read people in situations where reading wrong had consequences. The specific language of someone calculating odds, measuring exits, deciding what their options were. He wasn't panicking. That was concerning. People who panicked made rash decisions. People who didn't panic had thought through the scenario in advance, which meant this wasn't improvised. "You're not getting out of this building," she said. "There are armed military personnel on every floor." "They weren't here 20 minutes ago," he said. "They are now." Something moved behind his eyes, a reassessment. "You're the nurse," he said. She didn't answer. "The one who saved him." He looked at Marcus's still form in the bed, the slow rise and fall of sedated breathing, the monitoring lines, the fresh surgical site from Foss's follow-up work earlier. That was a problem. "For who?" He said nothing. "Someone sent you," she said, "to finish what didn't get finished this morning." The officer behind her had his sidearm clear of its holster now. She could hear the specific absence of sound that meant he was waiting for a clean angle. "There's no clean angle," the man at the wall said without looking away from her. He'd read the same thing she had, not without risking the valve. "Put the syringe down," Mara said. "Step away from the panel. This goes better for you if—" "Nothing goes better for me," he said. And there it was. The first thing he'd said that wasn't calculated, that had the texture of something true. Not resignation exactly, something more specific than that. The tone of someone who understood their options clearly and found them equally unpleasant. She took a half step forward. He tightened his hand on the valve. "Don't," he said. She stopped. She looked at the valve, at the syringe in his pocket, at his hand, which was steady. No tremor, no hesitation, nothing that suggested this was harder for him than it appeared. The room was completely still except for the metronomic sound of Marcus's heart monitor. Then the intercom on the wall crackled to life. Not the hospital PA. Something else. A different frequency. The flat quality of a transmission that was coming from somewhere inside the building rather than from the main system. A voice came through. Male. Unhurried. With the specific acoustic signature of someone speaking into a radio rather than a phone. "Blackridge Medical, this is a courtesy call." The man at the wall went rigid. Mara watched his face change, controlled to something less controlled in the space of 1 second. Whatever he'd expected, it wasn't this. The voice continued. "You have 40 minutes. I'd suggest using them wisely." The transmission ended. The room was silent. Pierce's officer looked at Mara. She looked at the man at the wall whose hand had gone white-knuckled on the oxygen valve, whose face was running through something that she couldn't fully read, but that included, unmistakably, fear. Not fear of them. Fear of whoever had just spoken. "Who was that?" she said. The man said nothing. His hand dropped from the valve. The officer moved and had him against the wall in 3 seconds. The syringe extracted and secured. The man's hands locked behind him with the controlled economy of someone who'd done it many times. He didn't resist. He just looked at the intercom on the wall, at the speaker that had gone silent, with the expression of a man who had just realized that the situation he thought he was controlling was being controlled by someone entirely different. Mara looked at the intercom too. 40 minutes. She didn't know what the countdown was counting toward. She didn't know whose voice that was. She didn't know yet what the syringe contained, or how many people in this building were part of whatever was happening, or where it had started, or how far it extended. But she knew 40 minutes, and she knew that the man now in handcuffs against the wall of the ICU was not the architect of this afternoon. He was an instrument. Someone else had built the plan, had sent him here, had apparently been watching the building's communications closely enough to know when to interrupt. The heart monitor beeped. Marcus's BP was steady on the screen. She looked at him, really looked at him for the first time since that morning when he'd been a wound and a countdown, and she hadn't had the luxury of seeing him as a person. He was younger than she'd have guessed from the file. There was a bruise at his temple that hadn't been there in her notes from earlier, which meant someone had gotten close to him before this afternoon. Before the shooting, even. Before. The thought arranged itself, and she didn't like the shape of it. "Get Pierce," she said. "He's with... Get him now, and seal this floor." She looked at the man against the wall. Nobody in or out until Pierce has heard that transmission. "We recorded it," the officer said. "Auto capture on all hospital frequencies." "Good." She looked at the clock on the wall. "We have 38 minutes. She walked to the nurse's station and picked up the desk phone, because the direct line to the floor below was faster than her cell in a building with sporadic signal, and because 38 minutes was not a number that encouraged waiting. The nurse watched her. "Who are you?" the nurse said. "I worked here," Mara said. "This morning." It was the most accurate thing she could say. She dialed. Outside the ICU windows, the hospital's outer lights were all on now, the parking lot fully illuminated, and somewhere on the roof the sound of rotors had changed pitch in a way that meant one of Pierce's helicopters had repositioned. She could hear it even through the insulated glass, that specific frequency change that her body recognized before her brain named it. Something was repositioning, which meant someone up there had heard the transmission and was already moving to respond to it. 37 minutes. Pierce picked up on the second ring. "Admiral," she said, "someone just broadcast on your frequency. Male voice, unidentified. He said we have 40 minutes. Pierce said nothing for 2 seconds. "He said we," Mara added. "Not you. We." Another second. "Voss?" Pierce's voice was very flat and very controlled. "There's something you need to know. We ran the voice through analysis the moment the transmission ended." She waited. "The voice on that transmission," Pierce said. "According to our database, it belongs to a man named Daniel Rourke." She said nothing. "That would be significant," Pierce said, "except that Daniel Rourke is listed as killed in action 4 years ago, in country, the same operation you were attached to." The station nurse was looking at her. The officer with the arrested man was looking at her. The heart monitor beeped. Mara's hand tightened on the phone. 4 years ago, in country, the same operation. She knew that operation. She'd been there for the end of it, the part that had ended her career and been buried in a classified file. She'd seen the casualty list. She'd seen the names. Daniel Rourke had been on it. She had believed for 4 years that he was dead. 36 minutes, Pierce said. "I know," she said. She put the phone down. She looked at the arrested man, still against the wall, who had not spoken since the transmission ended, and who was looking at the floor with the expression of someone who understood now that the person who had sent him here had just announced something to this building with 40 minutes on the clock, and that being in this building when that clock ran out was not where he wanted to be. Mara understood the feeling. She also understood that leaving was not something she was going to do. She looked at the window, at the parking lot lights, at the edge of the tree line in the dark, the patchy second-growth hardwoods that hid nothing and went nowhere. 36 minutes. She picked up the desk phone again. She dialed Pierce back. He picked up before the first ring finished. "Tell me you have something." "I need the layout of this building's HVAC system," she said, "specifically where the main ventilation trunk lines converge. And I need it in the next 5 minutes." A pause. "Why?" "Because 40 minutes wasn't a threat. It was a notification. Whoever Rourke is now, he's already inside the building. That transmission wasn't external, Skun. The signal decay was wrong. It came from below us. Silence. Then, basement level has a mechanical room. Facility management. Who has access? Right now, anyone who bypassed the service corridor lock, which we know someone already did once tonight. She set the phone on the counter without hanging up and looked at the arrested man against the wall. He was still not looking at her. His breathing had changed, shallow, faster, and his shoulders were angled inward in the specific posture of someone trying to make themselves smaller than they were. The ventilation system, she said to him. That's the delivery mechanism. He didn't answer. Whatever's in that syringe, it's a sample, a test, or a prototype. The actual payload is bigger. His jaw moved. Barely. How much time do we actually have? She said. He looked up then, and his face had the quality she'd seen before in people who had committed to a course of action they no longer believed in but couldn't reverse. The particular exhaustion of someone on the wrong side of a decision they made a long time ago and have been carrying ever since. Less than he said, the man told her. She was already moving. The stairwell to the basement smelled like old concrete and pipe insulation, and Mara descended it faster than was technically advisable. With Pierce's officer, she'd learned his name was Trent, which she filed away without ceremony, 3 steps behind her and his radio up. Pierce had redirected 2 of his other personnel to the mechanical room from the ground floor entrance. They would arrive approximately 90 seconds before Mara and Trent, which was not the order she'd have chosen, but was the order she had. The arrested man had given them one additional piece of information before Trent had handed him off to the hospital security officer who'd arrived. Not eagerly, not voluntarily, but with the resigned cooperation of someone who'd done the math, and decided that what Rourke was planning was a line he hadn't fully understood he was crossing until he was standing in an ICU with a syringe. The agent in the ventilation system was aerosolized. It was designed to move through the main HVAC trunk lines and distribute through the hospital's air supply. At full release, in a building this size with this airflow configuration, the affected zone would cover the ICU, the surgical ward, 2 general floors, and the emergency department. He didn't know what the agent was. He said this in a way that Mara believed, which was worse than if he'd been lying, because it meant Rourke had compartmentalized his own people so thoroughly that the man sent to finish Marcus in his bed didn't know what was going to kill everyone else in the building. That was the kind of operational discipline that took years to develop. She knew, because she'd seen it developed. The basement corridor was low-ceilinged and poorly lit in the way of hospital infrastructure that nobody tours. Exposed conduit, painted concrete, the background noise of the building's mechanical systems running in their ordinary rhythm. She oriented by the sound. The main HVAC equipment would be loud, compressors and air handlers running full, the deep vibration of systems that moved large volumes of air through large structures. She followed the sound the way she'd learned to follow audio signatures in environments where visual reference wasn't reliable. Third door on the left had a new scratch on the handle plate. Recent, metal on metal. She pushed through. The mechanical room was enormous, or felt enormous in the way that utility spaces do when you're used to clinical hallways, with equipment banks running the length of both long walls and a central corridor of floor-to-ceiling ductwork that fed the main trunk lines upward through the building. The air handlers were running at full, which meant the noise was significant and line of sight was broken by the equipment itself and the spray of conduit and connection hardware overhead. Pierce's 2 officers were inside. One was at the far end near the primary air handler controls. The other was in the middle of the room, weapon drawn, focused on something Mara couldn't see yet from the door. She moved in along the left wall, using the equipment bank for cover, and cleared her angle. Daniel Rourke was crouched beside the main ventilation trunk access, a large rectangular panel on the lower section of the primary ductwork, currently open, with a device attached to the interior of the panel that Mara identified in about 1 second as a pressurized dispersal unit. Small, matte gray, the kind of engineering that didn't come from a hardware store. He was making an adjustment to it. He heard her, or sensed her, the change in the room's acoustic environment when another person enters. He looked up. He was 50, maybe 52. The years since the operation had changed him in specific ways. more angular, more gray, a scar along the left jaw that hadn't been there before. But the essential structure of the face was the one she'd seen across a tactical table, in a country that didn't appear in her service record, in the 48 hours before everything had gone wrong. "Voss," he said. Just that. No surprise, as though he'd known she was in the building and had been waiting to see when she'd arrive. "Step away from it," she said. He didn't move. His hand stayed on the device. "You look like you've had a bad day." "Daniel, nobody's called me that in 4 years." He said it without nostalgia, just information. One of Pierce's officers said, "Sir, step back from the equipment, hands where I can see them." "Your people can't shoot me," Rourke said pleasantly. "Not while my hand's on the trigger assembly. The dispersal happens on release pressure. You put a bullet in me, my hand comes off this. We all find out what the ventilation system does with a binary nerve agent at full atmospheric pressure." The room went very still. Mara looked at the device. She looked at his hand on it. The specific way his thumb was positioned, the trigger assembly configuration she could partially see from her angle. He wasn't bluffing about the release mechanism. The device was rigged for dead man activation, binary nerve agent. The arrested man upstairs hadn't known. But she did now. "What is this for?" she said. She kept her voice even, not because she felt even, but because even was what this situation required and she had the muscle for it. "Marcus survived the shooting. You sent someone to finish it. That failed. So now, what? Everyone in this building?" "Unfinished work," Rourke said. "Marcus is one person. There are 200 patients in this building. Operational necessity." He said it the way someone says a phrase they've rehearsed, with a flatness that was its own kind of tell. He didn't believe it the way he needed to believe it. It was justification language, not conviction language, and Mara had heard enough of both to know the difference. "You were declared dead," she said. "You could have stayed dead. Whatever this is, whatever you think this finishes, you had 4 years of not doing it. Why now?" Something changed in his face, not much, a tightening around the eyes. "Pierce is here," he said. "He came for his nephew. He's here. And when he leaves, he goes back with what he knows, and what he starts looking at because of what he knows, and eventually what he finds." He paused. "There are people who can't afford him finding it. I'm one of them." "So you burn the building." "I eliminate the reason he came." He looked at her steadily. "Marcus was the thread. I pull the thread. Pierce goes home with a burial, and the file stays closed." "The file with my name in it," Mara said. "Among others." She held his gaze. He was watching her with the particular attention of someone trying to determine which version of her was standing in this room, the nurse from this afternoon or the person she'd been before. She understood the question. She'd been asking it herself for 4 years. "You didn't know I was here," she said, "when you set this up." "No," he said. "That was inconvenient. Because I was a variable you hadn't accounted for. Because you saving that boy is what brought Pierce into this building." He said it without bitterness, which was somehow worse than if he'd been angry. If he died on that table, it was a clean shooting. Soldier, hospital, no witnesses to the specifics. Pierce gets notified from a distance. He grieves. He doesn't come. Rourke looked at her. "You made this harder." "I made him alive," she said. "Yes," Rourke said. "You did." His thumb shifted slightly on the trigger assembly. Trent, behind Mara, made a small involuntary sound that he cut off immediately. Mara didn't move. She held Rourke's eyes and ran the geometry. She was 6 feet from him. The device was rigged dead man. His hand was on the assembly with enough grip that a lunge from her wouldn't be fast enough to reposition it. He'd read the move and release before she got there, or the impact would produce the same result. Pierce's officers couldn't shoot without the same problem, but she could see the assembly. She'd worked with pressurized dispersal systems in a different context, not building scale, smaller, different application, but the engineering principles were the same. The trigger assembly he had his thumb on was the release valve. The device needed both a chemical catalyst and pressure differential to activate. If the pressure line was interrupted upstream of the valve, the dead man activation would produce pressure release without the catalyst mixing, which meant the device would fail to disperse. The pressure line ran from the device up to a connection point on the duct interior. She could see the fitting from here, just inside the open panel. Small, copper-threaded, the kind that required a quarter turn to seat and the same quarter turn to separate. She needed to get to the fitting before his thumb left the valve. She looked at Rourke. She kept looking at him, because looking at the fitting would tell him exactly what she'd seen. "You trained under Hargreave," she said. His eyes moved slightly, surprised she knew. "So did I," she said. "Different rotation, same framework." "I know," he said. "I saw your evaluation." "Then you know how he taught field disassembly?" Rourke went very still. "Left-hand pressure line," she said. "Fitting release is a quarter turn counterclockwise." He understood what she'd said a half-second before she moved, and she saw the understanding in his face. Not panic, but the rapid recalculation of someone who has just realized the person across from them has been reading the board, not the conversation. And by then she was already moving, left along the equipment bank, not toward him but toward the panel, angled to put herself adjacent to the duct interior rather than in his direct line. He pulled his thumb. The release valve activated. The pressure line separator went counterclockwise in her hand at the same instant. There was a sound, a sharp mechanical exhale from the device as the release pressure discharged. And then nothing. No dispersal. No cascade. The catalyst and the propellant were in separate chambers that the pressure differential was supposed to combine, and without the pressure line intact, the combination didn't happen. The device vented harmlessly into the sealed interior of the ductwork panel. Mara's shoulder hit the concrete floor because she'd thrown herself clear of the panel on instinct, and the impact was not clean. It knocked the air out of her, and she heard rather than felt something in her left arm that wasn't quite right, a specific complaint from the shoulder joint that she noted and set aside. Trent and the two officers were on Rourke in under 2 seconds. She heard the sounds of that without seeing it because she was looking up at the ceiling of the mechanical room, at the exposed conduit and the old concrete, catching her breath, running a rapid self-inventory the way she always had after something like this. A methodical scan from feet to head, cataloging damage, categorizing severity, determining function. Left shoulder, complaint, limited range, possible partial dislocation. Not ideal, but functional. Ribs, impact pain, breathing intact, no structural compromise she could identify. Everything else, present and operational. She sat up. Rourke was on the ground, controlled, with Trent's knee in the center of his back. He wasn't struggling. He had his cheek against the concrete floor and his hands behind him, and he was looking at the vented dispersal device with an expression that contained something Mara hadn't expected. Not defeat. Something more complicated. Something that looked almost like relief. She looked at him. "You knew I could stop it," she said. He said nothing. "You told me the deployment mechanism, when you explained why the dead man trigger mattered." She worked her shoulder carefully, finding the joint's limits. "You described it in enough detail that anyone with field experience and a working knowledge of pressurized systems could identify the pressure line." He still said nothing, but his expression had shifted, the relief more visible now, less controlled. "Rourke," she said. He closed his eyes. "Who sent you here?" she said. "And who told them Marcus was going to be at Blackridge this morning?" He was quiet for a long time. Trent's radio crackled with Pierce's voice asking for status, and Trent responded in clipped, accurate shorthand without releasing his position. Then Rourke said, very quietly to the floor, "The order to shoot Marcus didn't come from me." Mara looked at him. "I planned the dispersal event. That was mine. Damage containment, like I said. But the original order, the targeting of Pierce's nephew specifically." He paused. "That came from someone inside this hospital, someone who knew he was coming before the ambulance called it in." The mechanical room was very cold and very loud, and Mara's shoulder was sending signals she was continuing to ignore. She looked at Trent. Trent was already on the radio. She stood up, because sitting on the floor of a mechanical room was not where she wanted to be when the next layer of this came open. And her legs were functional, even if her shoulder wasn't happy, and the number she was running in her head now was not 40 minutes anymore. The number was, one person in this hospital had known Marcus was coming. Before the ambulance radio call. Before any official notification. Before the shooting, which meant before the event that triggered all of this. Someone inside Blackridge Regional had known an active military officer was going to be brought to this specific facility and had passed that information to the people who shot him. She thought about the morning, about the sequence of events, about who had been where and when. She thought about the IV line that the arrested man upstairs had been working on. She thought about the fact that Marcus's chart had contained his military status. Unusual for a civilian facility. The kind of detail that ended up in an intake record when the paramedics relayed it from someone who'd flagged it at the scene. The paramedic relay would have gone through the hospital's intake coordination system. The intake coordination system had a duty supervisor on every shift. She looked at Trent. "I need to see this morning's intake logs," she said, "specifically the duty coordination record for the 11:45 window." Trent looked at her. "You think someone on staff?" "I think someone in this building made a phone call this morning between the ambulance radio patch and the time Marcus arrived," she said. "And I think if we find that call, we find whoever was running Rourke." She was moving toward the stairwell door when her phone buzzed. She pulled it out. Unknown number. But not Pierce's office. Different prefix, different routing signature, and she knew the difference. She answered. Silence for 2 seconds. Then a voice she knew. Not Rourke. Not Pierce. Not anyone from this afternoon. A voice from 4 years ago. From a mission that didn't exist in any official record. From the classified operation that had ended her military career and supposedly killed Daniel Rourke and 2 other operators and left Mara with a discharge that looked honorable on paper but felt like nothing of the kind. "Mara," the voice said, "you really should have just let him die this morning." Her hand tightened on the phone. "Who is this?" she said, though her body already knew, had already processed the vocal pattern and matched it against a memory she'd spent 4 years trying not to access. "Someone who has been watching your very productive day," the voice said, "and who needs you to understand something before this goes any further." She waited. "The file that Pierce pulled today, your service record. The classified version." A pause. "It has a co-author. Someone who added material after your discharge. Material that changes the picture considerably." "What material?" she said. "Enough to put you in a room for a long time," the voice said. "Unless we come to an arrangement." Her shoulder hurt. The concrete floor of the mechanical room was gray and industrial, and Trent was staring at her with an expression of controlled concern. Rourke was still face down on the floor, eyes open now, watching her. "Who are you?" she said again. Differently this time. The voice said a name, and the name was Glenn Marsh. Glenn Marsh. She said nothing for 3 seconds, which was how long it took her to run the immediate implications and arrive at the ones that mattered most right now. "You're not calling from inside this building," she said. "No," Marsh said. "Where are you?" "Somewhere more comfortable than a hospital basement." A pause. "The arrangement I'm proposing is simple. You walk away from whatever Rourke just told you. You don't hand Pierce the intake logs. You let this afternoon be what it looks like. A terminated nurse, a security incident, a chemical device that didn't work. You go to Dunmore. You see your sister. You put this day behind you." She looked at Rourke on the floor. He was still watching her. "And my service record," she said, "stays clean. The added material disappears. Your career, such as it was, remains what it was." "You're offering to protect something you contaminated," she said. "I'm offering a practical solution to a problem that doesn't have to be yours." His voice had the particular quality she'd heard in that conference room this afternoon. Administrative calm, the composure of a man who had navigated difficult situations through careful management of information and found it reliable. "You're very good at what you do, Mara. I've understood that since this morning. This doesn't have to end your life." "Someone tried to kill a soldier in the ICU 20 minutes ago," she said, "because you called someone this morning." Silence. "That's what Rourke just told you," Marsh said. Careful. Not confirming. "He told me the targeting order came from inside this hospital," she said. "I'm looking at intake logs in my head and working out who had the access, the foreknowledge, and the motivation. You want to tell me I'm wrong? I'm listening." Another silence. Longer. "Walk away, Mara," he said. She hung up. She looked at Trent. "Where's Pierce right now?" "ICU. With Marcus." "Get him on the phone. Tell him we need the intake coordination logs from the 11:45 window pulled and secured before anyone with administrative clearance can access them." She was already moving toward the stairwell. "And tell him Marsh isn't in the building." Trent was on his radio before she finished the sentence. The intake logs took 11 minutes to secure, which was 8 minutes longer than she wanted and 3 minutes faster than the hospital's IT department had said was possible when Pierce's officer made the request. Mara spent those 11 minutes in the corridor outside the server room on the ground floor, with her shoulder complaining in a way she was now assigning a specific number to, 6 out of 10, not structural, manageable, and her mind running the architecture of what she knew against what she needed. Marsh had left the building. That was the first thing. He'd been gone before Rourke's broadcast, which meant he'd known the timeline and had put himself clear of it. Administrative meeting, early departure, something that would appear in a log as routine. He'd been managing the optics since this morning. The firing, the conference room, the legal presence, the calibrated response to Pierce. All of it controlled. All of it positioning. A man who has been doing this a long time, she thought. Not a man who improvised this afternoon. A man who had infrastructure in place, who understood the value of information inside a medical facility, and who had spent long enough in a director's chair to know exactly who came through the intake system and what their records contained. Military status in an intake record was unusual for a civilian ER. She'd thought that this morning without following the thread, because this morning she'd been busy keeping someone alive. The paramedics had relayed Marcus's status because someone had flagged it at the scene. Standard in some contexts, but the specific flag would have gone to the duty intake coordinator, who would have logged it, and that log would show who accessed it, and when, and what was done with it. The IT officer, a young woman named Besley, who had the focused energy of someone who found comfort in the clarity of data systems when human systems were behaving badly, came out of the server room at the 11-minute mark with a tablet and the expression of someone who had just seen something they wished they hadn't. 11:52, Besley said. The intake record for the GSW, patient name Marcus Solon, military status flagged in the paramedic relay, was accessed from the administrative clearance tier. The user credential is director level. Mr. Marsh's log in. Mara looked at the tablet. The timestamp was clean and absolute, 11:52, which was 5 minutes after the ambulance radio patch, which was 19 minutes before Marcus arrived. An outbound call from the director's office line, she said, between 11:52 and 12:10. Besley looked back at the tablet. There's an extension log. One call, outbound 11:58. To a number that's registered to a property management company in, she squinted, Carver Junction. Mara knew the name. It was a specific kind of name. The kind of name you gave a shell entity when you needed a phone number that wasn't easily traceable but wasn't meant to withstand serious scrutiny. Not professional-grade cover. The kind of operational carelessness that accumulates when someone has been doing something for long enough that they've stopped expecting to be caught. Send it to Pierce's communications officer, Mara said. All of it. The access log, the call record, the number. Besley sent it. Trent appeared at the end of the corridor. Pierce wants you upstairs. Pierce was in the small family consultation room adjacent to the ICU, which was the most private space available on that floor, and was now crowded with 4 of his officers, a federal communications specialist who had materialized from somewhere in the last hour, and Dina Pratt, who was sitting in the corner with the expression of someone who has been included in a situation above their pay grade and is handling it with more composure than most people would. Mara came in, shoulder still 6 out of 10, and Pierce looked at her arm and said, "You need that looked at." "Later," she said. "It's not a suggestion. It will still need looking at in 20 minutes. Right now." "Marsh," Pierce said. "Yes." He turned to the communications officer, who pulled up a screen on his equipment that showed a call trace, the outbound number from Marsh's office line, routed through the property management shell, and from there to a secondary relay that connected to a prepaid number that had been active for 6 weeks and was last used approximately 40 minutes ago. 40 minutes ago was when Mara had been in the mechanical room. "He called someone after I hung up on him," she said. 2 calls, the communications officer said. 1 immediately after a call that terminated 43 minutes ago. Second call, 3 minutes later, to a different number. That second number traces to a vehicle registered in Carver Junction. He looked up. The vehicle's GPS, it's a rental, Fleet GPS, he Puts it currently at Black Ridge County Airport, 17 minutes from here. Pierce looked at Mara. He's running, she said. He was running before you called him back, Pierce said. The first call was inbound, from the Carver Junction number, which means someone called Marsh to tell him the mechanical room had failed. Someone inside the building. She went through the roster in her head. Rourke in custody, the arrested man from the ICU in custody, Pierce's team controlling all external access points. But Pierce's team had arrived and deployed within a specific perimeter, and a hospital of this size, this complexity, with this many staff moving through it, there were gaps. There were always gaps. Who else was operational tonight? She said to the communications officer. The Carver Junction number, has it been in contact with anyone inside this building? The officer worked for 90 seconds. 2 numbers. One is the prepaid that Marsh used. The other is... He paused. It's a hospital extension, internal line, 3rd floor, administrative wing. Everyone in the room understood what that meant. Who has that extension? Mara said. It's assigned to the Deputy Director of Operations, Dina said, from the corner. Everyone looked at her. Dina had her hands folded in her lap and was looking at the floor with the expression of someone completing a calculation she'd been running for a while and had arrived at an answer that didn't feel good. Victor Gale. He's been here 14 months, came from... She looked up. He came with a recommendation from Marsh when Marsh brought him on. Pierce said to his officer, "Find Gale." The officer was on the radio before Pierce finished. Known. Victor Gale was not in the administrative wing. He was not in his office, not in the building's common areas, not in any of the locations that the hospital's internal badge tracking system, which Pierce's team had accessed through the hospital's own security infrastructure, showed him having accessed in the last 2 hours. His badge had last been used at 1740 to access the 3rd floor administrative corridor. 1740 was approximately 15 minutes before Mara had gone to the basement. His car was in the parking lot, which meant either he was still in the building using spaces that didn't have badge readers, of which there were several, in older sections of the infrastructure, or he'd left on foot. Mara stood in the consultation room and thought about the building's layout, the way she'd been thinking about it all day, which was involuntarily and continuously. The architectural memory that her brain built in any environment she spent time in. The older section. The section that predated the current administration, with corridors that connected to the service infrastructure in ways that weren't always reflected in the current building maps. The service corridor on the 2nd floor, she said, the one that was already open tonight. Where does the other end of it go? Trent pulled up the building schematic on his tablet. He looked at it. He looked at Mara. Loading dock, he said. East side. It exits behind the linen services building. The loading dock was outside the perimeter Pierce had established at the hospital's main entrance and emergency access. It was on the building's opposite side, in a section that was staffed during the day and empty at night. Go, Pierce said. Not to Mara, to 2 of his officers. They went. Mara followed, which Pierce permitted with a look that communicated both acknowledgement and the clear understanding that arguing would take longer than the situation allowed. Victor Gale was in the loading bay. Not at the exterior exit, he hadn't made it that far. He was in the interior section, between the building's linen service corridor and the outer roll door, crouched behind a row of industrial laundry carts with a phone in his hand when Pierce's officers came through both ends of the corridor simultaneously. He stood up with his hands at chest height in the specific posture of someone who has been caught badly and is processing that fact in real time. He was younger than Mara had expected from Dina's description. Early 40s, slight, with the kind of nondescript appearance that she associated with people who had built their professional identity around not being the most visible person in any given room. He looked at Pierce's officers and then past them at Mara, and something in his face went through a rapid sequence of calculations and arrived at an outcome he didn't like. "I want an attorney," he said. "You'll have one," Pierce's officer said. "Hands behind your head." He complied. His phone was bagged. Mara glanced at it as it was secured. The screen had been active when they came through the door. A text draft to the Carver Junction number. She couldn't read what it said, but the fact that he'd been composing rather than calling told her he'd understood the communications were being monitored and had been trying to use a text relay instead. Pierce arrived at the loading bay 3 minutes later, coming through the service corridor in end, and he stood in front of Gail with his hands behind his back and said nothing for a moment. Gail said, "I'm not saying anything without—" "You don't have to say anything," Pierce said. "We have the call records. We have the access log. We have a device in the basement that failed, and the man who built it in custody, and he has been talking for approximately 25 minutes. He paused. "The only question right now is whether you want to continue being a secondary figure in this or become the primary one." Gail looked at him. "Marsh left," Gail said. "Yes. He said there was a contingency. If the evening's operation failed, there was an exit." His voice had the specific toneless quality of someone who has been betrayed by the logic of their own investment in another person's plan. He didn't mention the exit was only for him. Pierce looked at him with the particular expression of someone who is not surprised but is recording the information carefully. "Where is he going?" Mara said. Gail looked at her. There was a moment where he did the calculation. Loyalty to Marsh against the weight of everything that had happened tonight, against the plain evidence that Marsh had built a contingency that didn't include him. The calculation didn't take long. "He has a contact in the transport sector," Gail said. "Private aviation. The county airport is the first leg, but he won't stay there. There's a charter to He stopped. Recalibrated. "I don't know the destination. He never told me the full route." "But he's at the county airport," Pierce said. "He was heading there, yes." Pierce turned to Trent, who was already on the radio, and said 2 words that contained everything necessary. "Ground it." The federal authority to ground private aviation in a county airfield came through in less than 4 minutes, which was the kind of timeline that was only possible when the person making the request had the rank and the circumstances to justify immediate action. Mara knew this because she'd been in enough situations where the bureaucratic machinery moved slowly and a few where it moved fast, and the difference was always about who was asking and what they were asking about. Tonight, Pierce was asking, and what he was asking about was a man who had coordinated a shooting, an attempted assassination in an ICU, and a planned chemical dispersal event inside a civilian medical facility. The timeline was 4 minutes. Marsh's rental car was confirmed at the county airfield at the time the ground order came through. There was one private charter on the active manifest, a 6-seat turboprop filed under a corporate flight account registered to an entity whose name Mara didn't recognize but whose registration address was the same county as the Carver Junction Shell Company. Federal agents from the nearest field office were on their way. Pierce's team was coordinating. Mara was in the second-floor corridor outside the administrative wing, with Trent and the building schematic on his tablet, and her shoulder now at 7 out of 10 because she'd moved it wrong coming through the loading bay corridor. She sat down on a bench outside the administrative corridor entrance. This was not a defeat. It was an assessment. The injury needed attention, and she had been ignoring it for 2 hours on the understanding that there were more urgent priorities, and both of those things were still true. But she was also aware that ignoring a partial dislocation for extended periods produced complications that she would have lectured a patient about. She found the angle, braced her arm against the wall, and relocated the joint herself. It was briefly very unpleasant. Trent looked at her with an expression that suggested he was revising his professional assessment of her in some direction. "You should have a medic look at that," he said. "I just did," she said, and stood up. The shoulder was now 5 out of 10, manageable. She moved it through a careful partial range and found the function acceptable. Pierce came back to the second floor at 9:18. He found Mara in the administrative wing corridor sitting across from the door to Marsh's office, which had been sealed by Pierce's team at 9:02. She'd been waiting there, not because there was anything to do, but because this was the quietest part of the building currently, and she needed a moment that wasn't active response. He sat down beside her on the bench. This struck her as unusual enough that she looked at him. He looked tired, not the operational fatigue of the last several hours. Something older than that, the specific weight of a man who had arrived at a hospital to be with his injured nephew and had found himself standing in the middle of something that extended far beyond that and would take months to fully excavate. "Marcus is awake," Pierce said. She hadn't expected that to land the way it did. She kept her face steady. He's asking about you again, Pierce said. Second time tonight. He doesn't know me, she said. He knows you opened his chest on a trauma table while someone was telling you not to. She said nothing. Pierce looked down the corridor. Marsh is in federal custody. They picked him up on the tarmac. He was on the plane. He paused. He didn't resist. Just sat down when they came aboard and said he wanted his attorney. Apparently he was very calm about it. He would be, she said. He's been managing the optics of difficult situations for a long time. His attorney is going to have a complicated week, Pierce said. We have the intake log access. We have the call record. We have Rourke in custody, and Gale in custody, and a failed chemical device with his organizational fingerprints on the infrastructure that funded it. He paused. Rourke gave us 3 additional names tonight. 2 of them are in the intelligence sector. One of them is a name I recognized. She looked at him. Someone who was involved in the operation 4 years ago, Pierce said. On the administrative side. Someone who had access to your service record after your discharge. She understood what he was saying. The contamination in my file, she said. We'll have it reviewed, Pierce said, by people I trust, not the same people who signed off on your discharge. She was quiet for a moment. That's not a small thing, she said. No, he agreed. It isn't. The corridor was quiet. From somewhere in the building came the ordinary sounds of a hospital night. Wheels, voices at low volume, the distant rhythm of monitoring equipment, the building breathing around them, continuing its work. She thought about the morning, about the 11:45 ambulance patch, about the specific second when she'd looked at the saturation reading and done the math and understood there was no version of waiting that ended with Marcus alive. She thought about the conference room and Marsh's folded hands, and regardless of the patient outcome. What happens to the termination? She said. What do you want to happen to it? Pierce said. She considered that. It was a real question, not a rhetorical one, and it deserved a real answer. I want it to not have happened, she said. And since it did happen, I want the record to reflect what actually occurred and why. That's reasonable, Pierce said. That's achievable. And I want it to be clear, she said, that what Terrell did tonight, he moved when I needed him to move. He was the only other person in that trauma bay who made the right call. Whatever comes out of this, his record shouldn't have anything on it. Pierce nodded. I'll make sure of it. They sat for a moment in the quiet of the corridor. Your shoulder, Pierce said, reduced it myself. Of course you did. He stood up. There's a physician on the 3rd floor who's been looking for you for the last 40 minutes. He says you won't come to him, so he's going to come to you. I'm not hard to find, she said. No, Pierce said. You're generally exactly where the situation requires. He walked back toward the ICU. Mara looked at the sealed door of Marsh's office for a moment. At the official seal Pierce's team had placed across the gap between door and frame, the simple physical evidence of something that had been closed down and was now in the process of being examined. And she felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite relief, something that didn't have a clean name but had a specific physical location in her chest, slightly left of center. She stood up. The physician, when he found her, was a compact man in his 50s named Doctor Kellard, who examined her shoulder with the efficient thoroughness of someone who'd been doing orthopedic field assessment for a long time and was not easily impressed, and who said, after 3 minutes, "You relocated this yourself." Yes. It's correct. You shouldn't have needed to do it yourself. I was in a basement at the time. He looked at her over the rim of his glasses. There are going to be more people who want to talk to you tonight. Federal agents, Pierce's people, legal, eventually. I know. Before any of them get more than 5 minutes with you, I want imaging on this shoulder and you sitting still for 20 minutes drinking something with electrolytes in it. She looked at him. That's very specific. You're dehydrated. You have a reduced dislocation that needs monitoring, and from what I can tell, you've been running on the specific neurochemistry of a crisis state since approximately 11:40 this morning. He handed her a bottle from his bag. Sports drink, orange, the kind she'd have chosen herself. 20 minutes. Then they can have you. She took the bottle. Thank you, she said. He nodded once, professionally, and began documenting. She drank the orange thing and looked at the window at the end of the corridor. The parking lot lights, the dark tree line, the ordinary visible world going about its ordinary business outside a building where several things had been decided tonight that would take months to finish unfolding. The federal agents arrived at 10:04. There were 3 of them, 2 from the regional field office and 1 from a unit whose specific designation the lead agent gave her and which she recognized as the Federal Counterterrorism Coordination Division, which told her that the description of tonight's events had traveled up certain channels quickly. The lead agent was a woman named Ferris, mid-40s, with the compact directness of someone who had learned to get to what mattered without ceremony. She shook Mara's hand and said, "I've been briefed by Admiral Pierce. I have some questions." "All right," Mara said, starting with the mechanical room. "Walk me through your assessment of the device." Mara walked her through it. Then she walked her through the morning, the intake log, the call record, the ICU, Rourke's cooperation, Gale's information, the conversation with Marsh on the phone. Ferris listened the way Pierce listened, without interrupting, absorbing sequentially, asking clarifying questions only when the data required it. It took 40 minutes. When Mara finished, Ferris was quiet for a moment. "The file contamination," Ferris said. "Pierce told me about the classification issue with your service record." "It's a secondary concern," Mara said. "It's actually not," Ferris said. "If Marsh or someone connected to him introduced material into a classified military service record, that's a federal offense on top of everything else. It changes the scope of the investigation considerably." She paused. "It also potentially affects other people who were classified under that operation." Mara thought about Rourke, on the concrete floor of the mechanical room, looking at the vented device with something that had looked like relief. "How many people were under that classification?" Ferris asked. "I don't know the full number," Mara said. "I knew my own record. I didn't have access to others." "We'll need to pull the full manifest," Ferris said, more to herself than to Mara. She made a note. Then she looked up. "One more thing. Marsh on the phone. He said there was material in your file that could put you in a room for a long time. Those were his words?" "Approximately. He said it as a threat, as leverage." "Yes." Ferris nodded slowly. "That's going to be very useful to us," she said, "because it means he knew the contamination was there. He referenced it as a tool, which means he either introduced it himself or he knew who did and considered it an asset he controlled." Mara looked at her. "Either way, it connects him to the classified operation." "Either way," Ferris agreed, "it connects him to something he was not supposed to be connected to." The corridor was quiet. "We're going to need your cooperation over the coming weeks," Ferris said. "Interviews, potentially testimony. The device in the basement alone is a federal prosecution. The shooting this morning, the ICU incident, the file contamination, this is going to be a long case." "I understand," Mara said. Ferris stood. "For what it's worth, the person who called this correctly tonight, every step." She paused. "That wasn't luck." Mara said nothing. "Get some rest," Ferris said. We'll be in contact tomorrow." She left. The corridor was quiet again. Kellard had gone. Trent had been reassigned elsewhere in the building. It was past 11 now, nearly midnight, and the hospital had the specific character of institutional night. Reduced to its essential operations, the daytime social architecture collapsed into something more skeletal and honest. She stood at the corridor window and looked out at the parking lot, which was still active with federal vehicles now alongside Pierce's transport and the ordinary scatter of hospital staff parking. The tree line was invisible in the dark, just a mass against the sky. Her phone buzzed. "Petra," she answered. "Tell me what happened," Petra said. "Long story," Mara said. "I have time." She almost said, "I know," and then stopped herself because she didn't know, and Petra's time was real, and Mara had been very bad at understanding that for a while. "I'll tell you in person," she said. "Can I come over tonight?" "I've had the couch made up for 3 hours," Petra said. "I was waiting to see when you'd ask." Mara looked at the window, at the parking lot, at the dark. "Give me an hour," she said. She was about to hang up when Petra said quickly, "Mara, is it finished? The dangerous part?" She thought about Marsh in federal custody, about Rourke on the floor of the mechanical room, about Gale in the loading bay with his hands behind his head, About the intake logs, the call records, the sealed office door, the agents with their notebooks full of what she'd said. The dangerous part is finished, she said. She believed that was true. She was walking back toward the elevator when her phone buzzed again. Not Petra, not Pierce's office, not Ferris. The number was one she didn't recognize. Not a shell prefix, not a relay signature, just a number from a local area code that could have been anyone. She answered. Silence. Then a voice she had heard exactly once, briefly, years ago, in a context she had never discussed with anyone. Ms. Voss, the voice said, my name is Warren Kell. I was the case officer on the operation you were attached to 4 years ago. She stopped walking. I've been watching tonight, Kell said. I need you to understand something before the federal investigation goes further. Mr. Kell, the file contamination that Marsh referenced, he said. It isn't what he told you it was. He didn't introduce it. He found it. And the person who originally put it there, he paused. It wasn't anyone connected to tonight's events. She stood very still in the corridor. Who put it there? She said. Someone who was trying to protect you, Kell said, who made a decision 4 years ago that I've been trying to correct since, and who is now, another pause, longer, who is now in a position to come forward if the investigation creates the right conditions. If you cooperate with it fully, if you don't let Marsh's attorneys control the narrative in the first 48 hours. Her hand was tight on the phone. Give me a name, she said. The line was quiet for 3 seconds. The name in the contaminated file, Kell said, is Colonel Hargreave. The elevator at the end of the corridor opened. Pierce stepped out, looking at his phone, moving toward her with the pace of someone who had received information in the last 60 seconds that required his immediate attention. And when he saw her face, he stopped. He read her expression. What happened? He said. She looked at him, at the man who had arrived in this building to be with his injured nephew, who had stayed to dismantle something much larger than a hospital director's misconduct, whose clearance and authority had moved faster tonight than anything she'd moved in 4 years. She lowered the phone. Pierce, she said, how well did you know Colonel Hargreave? The corridor was very quiet. Pierce's expression did not change in any way that she could name, but something in it shifted. The specific, almost imperceptible shift of a person who has just heard a question they've been expecting for a long time and had hoped, on some level, would not arrive tonight. Hargreave, he said. Yes. A beat. Why? He said. Because I need to know if the person who just called me is telling me the truth, she said. And the only way to know that is to understand how much you know about what Hargreave did after that operation was closed. Pierce looked at her for a long moment. The elevator behind him was still open, doors patient, light spilling into the corridor. He reached back and pressed the button to hold it. Come up to the 4th floor, he said. There's a room that's empty, and this is going to take a while. She stepped toward the elevator. She did not know yet what Pierce knew. She did not know what Hargreave had done or why, or whether Kell's account of protection had any truth in it, or whether the next 48 hours were going to vindicate her or open a second chapter of something she'd thought was closed. What she knew was the immediate next step, which was the elevator and the 4th floor and the conversation with Pierce, and after that, whatever came next. She stepped in. The doors closed. The 4th floor had a conference room that nobody had used tonight because it was the administrative overflow space, bland and functional, with a round table and chairs that didn't match, and a whiteboard someone had half erased weeks ago. Pierce turned on only the corner lamp, which gave the room the specific quality of late-night conversations. Lower stakes on the surface, higher stakes underneath. He sat down. She sat across from him. He was quiet for a moment, and she let him be quiet, because the thing she'd learned about people who held significant authority and significant information simultaneously was that they needed a beat before they spoke honestly. The authority was the performance. What came before the honest version was never silence. It was the small, invisible process of deciding to stop performing. Hargreave reached out to me, Pierce said, 8 months ago. She waited. He told me he had made a decision during the classification process after the operation, that there was material in several service records that didn't belong there. He didn't tell me whose. He said he'd been trying to find a way to correct it without opening the classified file publicly, because opening it publicly would expose operational details that would put people at risk. Pierce looked at the table. I told him to come forward formally. He said he needed more time. And then? Mara said. And then 6 weeks ago he died, Pierce said. Cardiac. He was 61. He paused. I've been sitting with what he told me for 8 months, not knowing whose records were affected, not knowing how to open something that was classified at a level that required Joint Committee authorization to access. She absorbed that. Kell was his case officer, she said. Kell was with him for 2 deployments. He would have known the full scope. Pierce looked at her. What exactly did Kell tell you? She gave it to him accurately. Kell's claim that Hargreave had introduced the contaminating material, that it had been intended as protection rather than damage, that Hargreave had been trying to correct it before his death. Pierce listened with the same quality he always listened with, and when she finished, he was quiet again. But it was a different kind of quiet this time, the kind that meant he was deciding something rather than processing something. Protection, he said. That's the word he used. From what? She'd been turning that over since the elevator. From whoever was already connected to what happened tonight. If Marsh found the material and considered it leverage, that means the material was incriminating to someone who was watching. If Hargreave put it there to look like it incriminated me, and the real target of that incrimination was someone else entirely, then it was misdirection, Pierce said. Yes. He looked at her steadily. That's a significant interpretation of what Kell told you. I know. It could also be a narrative Kell is constructing to protect himself. Also, yes, she said. They sat with that. The honesty of it. The fact that she didn't know, couldn't know yet, and wasn't going to pretend otherwise, was something she'd have been unable to offer 4 years ago. 4 years ago, she would have needed the explanation to be true, because the alternative was that Hargreave had damaged her for reasons she hadn't earned and couldn't fight. She'd needed the story to make sense. Tonight she was tired enough, and had been through enough in the last 14 hours, to sit with the version that didn't yet make complete sense and find it tolerable. I'm going to contact Kell through official channels, Pierce said. Tomorrow. And I'm going to request the joint authorization to open the classification on that operation. He paused. It will take time. It won't be fast or clean, but it will be thorough. That's all I'm asking for, she said. He looked at her. Is it? She thought about it honestly. No, she said. I'm also asking for it to mean something when it's done, not just a correction in a file, something that says what happened to the people who were under that classification and what was done to their records and who knew and when. Public accountability, he said. Yes. Pierce nodded, once, with the weight of someone accepting a responsibility rather than acknowledging a request. They sat in the half-lit conference room for another few minutes, not speaking. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was the specific silence of 2 people who have been through a difficult thing together and are on the other side of it, not yet at the point of knowing what the other side looks like, but past the crisis. Then Pierce said, Marcus wants to meet you. She looked at him. He's been awake for 3 hours, Pierce said. He's been told the basics of this evening. He asked me twice if you were still in the building. He paused. I told him you were. He said to tell you he wasn't going anywhere if you wanted to come by. She looked at the table, at the half-erased whiteboard, at her own hands, which had been through a great deal since 11:40 this morning. All right, she said. Check. Marcus Solon was awake and upright at about 30 degrees in the ICU bed, with the specific alert quality of someone whose body was doing the enormous background work of acute recovery while their mind ran ahead of it. He was younger looking awake than she'd registered this morning, with a directness in his eyes that she associated with people who'd had a few near misses and stopped wasting their attention on things that didn't matter. He looked at her when she came in. She stood at the foot of the bed. You're smaller than I expected, he said. People say that, she said. My uncle described you as... He stopped. Actually, I'm not going to repeat that. He'd be annoyed. He looked at her with the straightforward attention of someone taking inventory. How's your shoulder? Functional. He told me about the basement. He said it without drama, which she appreciated. You could have left the building. I know. But you didn't. No. He was quiet for a moment. Then, this morning, I don't remember most of it. The medic said I was pretty far under by the time I came through the door. You were. But you were there. Yes. He looked at her in a way that had something complicated in it. Gratitude, she thought, but not the performed kind, not the kind that required a transaction. Something more like recognition, the kind that passes between people who understand certain things about certain situations without requiring the full explanation. Thank you, he said. She nodded, not dismissively, with the specific weight of someone accepting something that is genuinely meant. Get some sleep, she said. You have a long recovery. So I'm told. He settled back slightly. My uncle says you might be sticking around. I don't know what I'm doing yet, she said honestly. Fair enough. He closed his eyes. I hope you do, though. Stick around. A pause. This place could use someone who knows what they're doing. She left him to sleep. The weeks that followed were not clean. They were not a montage of satisfying resolutions arriving in the right order. They were paperwork and federal interviews and waiting and more waiting, and occasional phone calls from Ferris or from Pierce's legal office that delivered information in the careful, qualified language of an active investigation that was not yet complete. Glenn Marsh was formally charged on 9 counts, including conspiracy to commit murder, coordination of a domestic chemical threat, obstruction, and criminal misuse of protected medical information. His attorney was, as Ferris had predicted, having a complicated time. The call record and the intake log access formed the core of the prosecution's case, and they were the kind of digital evidence that didn't require interpretation. They were timestamps and account credentials and outbound phone numbers, and they said what they said regardless of what anyone argued about them. Victor Gale cooperated. His cooperation produced 3 additional names in the network that Marsh had been operating inside for the better part of a decade: a procurement contractor, a shell company attorney, and a hospital administrator in another county who had been running a parallel operation in a different facility. The federal case expanded outward the way these cases do, slow and methodical, like water finding its level. Daniel Rourke's cooperation was more complex and ultimately more valuable. He had been inside the network longer than anyone else in custody, had operational knowledge that extended beyond the immediate events at Blackridge, and had made the decision to cooperate fully and quickly and without conditions. The federal attorneys described this, in their careful language, as providing substantial assistance. Mara thought about him on the floor of the mechanical room, the relief in his face when the device vented harmlessly, and understood that he had been looking for an exit for a long time and had found one in the worst possible place at the only moment it was available to him. She didn't forgive him. That wasn't the word for what she felt about it. She just understood it, which was a different thing and in some ways harder. The classification review on the 4-year-old operation took 6 weeks to authorize and another 3 to execute. Kell came forward formally, as he'd indicated, and his account held under examination. Hargreave had introduced the material, had done so to create a false trail of incrimination leading to Mara's record rather than to the operational details that would have exposed the network that Marsh was later found to be connected to. It was a decision Hargreave had made unilaterally, without Mara's knowledge or consent, with the intention of protecting the broader operation by making her record appear to be the sensitive element that needed protection. It had worked, in the narrow sense. The network had not been exposed through the classified file. In every other sense, it had taken 4 years of Mara's life and her career and her ability to explain herself to anyone, and Hargreave had died before he could complete what he'd told Pierce he was trying to fix. Pierce told her this in a phone call, sitting at Petra's kitchen table in Dunmore on a Tuesday morning when the light was coming through the window at a specific angle that made everything look more resolved than it was. The review board's determination, Pierce said, is that the contaminating material is to be removed from your record and that your service documentation be restored to its accurate state. The board is also recommending a formal commendation for your actions during the operation itself, which were, according to the operational records, considerably beyond what was captured in the edited version. She said nothing for a moment. Mara, Pierce said. I heard you, she said. I know you did. It doesn't give me the 4 years back, she said. No, he said. It doesn't. I'm not going to tell you it does. She looked at the light on the kitchen table, at Petra's coffee cup, still there from the morning, at the ordinary texture of a Tuesday that was happening while all of this was being resolved. "Thank you," she said, "for pushing on it." "You did the work," he said. "I just had the authorization." She didn't argue with him because he was partly right and partly wrong, and the proportion didn't matter anymore. The hospital board convened a formal review of the termination 32 days after the events of that Thursday. The meeting was not closed, which was a decision the board's legal counsel had apparently argued against and lost. Dina was there. Terrell was there. Dr. Andrea Foss was there, and gave a clinical account of what she had found when she walked into Trauma Bay 1 that was precise and unambiguous and left very little room for the kind of institutional interpretation that might have softened the picture. Dr. Holt was there too. He sat in the third row and said nothing and left before the meeting was formally closed. The board's determination was unanimous. The termination of Mara Voss was rescinded, her record expunged of any notation of the event, and the board issued a formal written apology that Mara read once and put away. They offered her a position, not floor nursing, a leadership role. Director of Clinical Emergency Protocols, a newly created position that acknowledged both her civilian experience and a background that the board was now, carefully and without specific detail, aware she possessed. She sat with the offer for 4 days before she answered. When she called the board chair back, she said, "I'll take it, but I have one condition." The board chair, a woman named Dr. Sylvia Tran, who had the efficient warmth of someone who had sat through a great many difficult meetings and emerged from them with her decency intact, said, "Tell me." "No medical professional at this institution," Mara said, "is ever punished for making a clinical decision that saves a life. Not by an attending, not by administration, not by process." She paused. "If the decision was wrong, we review it, we learn from it, we improve. But punishment for trying, that ends. A beat." "That's not a condition," Dr. Tran said. "That's a policy. And frankly, it should have been one already." "Then we're agreed," Mara said. "We're agreed." She went back to the building on a Wednesday morning, 7 weeks after the Thursday she'd walked out of it with a box under her arm. The lobby looked the same floors, same information desk, same ambient sound of a building doing the relentless work of keeping people alive. Dwight was at the security station, and he nodded at her with a warmth that didn't require any elaboration, and she nodded back. Terrell was at the nursing station on the second floor. He saw her coming off the elevator, and his expression did the thing that expressions do when someone arrives, that you'd been hoping would arrive. Not performance, just the involuntary response of a person whose equilibrium is restored by a presence they'd missed. "Heard you were coming back," he said. "Heard you kept the floor running," she said. He shrugged, with the specific modesty of someone who'd done more than that and knew she knew it. "Somebody had to." "Thank you," she said, "for the morning, for moving when I asked." He looked at her steadily. "You didn't have to ask twice." "I know," she said. That meant everything. She kept walking. The new office, her office, which was a sentence she had to sit with for a moment to let it be real, was on the third floor, in a section of the administrative wing that had been reorganized following Marcia's departure and Gail's arrest. It was smaller than Marcia's office and plainer, and had a window that looked out at the same rear parking lot and tree line she'd looked at from the waiting room on that Thursday evening, which struck her as the kind of detail that either meant something or meant nothing, depending on how you felt about symmetry. She put her bag down. She looked out the window. The second-growth hardwoods at the edge of the lot had filled in a little over the 7 weeks. It was that season, things putting out new growth in the specific stubborn way of things that had been cut down and were returning anyway, patchy and irregular, and not particularly graceful about it, but doing it regardless. She thought about the morning Marcus had come through the Trauma Bay doors, about the math she'd done in real time and the decision it produced, about the 11 hours that had followed, the conference room, the lobby, the ICU, the mechanical room floor, the elevator, the fourth-floor conversation with Pierce in the half-lit room. She thought about the 4 years before that, about the weight of a service record that said one thing when the truth said something different, about the specific loneliness of carrying a version of yourself that you couldn't show to anyone because the documentation didn't support it. She thought about the fact that documentation had been corrected now, that the commendation existed, that the contaminating material was gone. She didn't feel fixed by it. She hadn't expected to. What she felt was something more honest and more durable than fixed. She felt like the floor was real again, like the ground under the whole structure was solid, which it hadn't been for 4 years, and which made the work ahead of her possible in a way it simply hadn't been before. Her phone buzzed. Petra. How is it? She looked at the window, at the parking lot and the tree line and the ordinary sky above it. She typed back, real. Petra sent back a single word that was a very Petra kind of response. Good. Mara put the phone in her pocket. She sat down at the desk. She opened the file that Dr. Tran had sent her, the preliminary framework for the new protocols, the staffing review, the gap analysis on the emergency response documentation that had been, as she already knew from working inside it, inadequate for a facility of this size and this patient population. There was a lot of work to do. She had never minded work. What she'd minded was working inside a structure that didn't tell the truth about itself, that buried what it couldn't explain and called that management. She'd spent 4 years watching institutions do that to people, and she'd had it done to her, and she understood now, more clearly than she had at 29, when she'd first encountered the full weight of what institutional power could do when it decided someone was inconvenient, that the answer was not to leave. The answer was to stay and be unmovable, not because it was comfortable. It wasn't. The work was going to be hard and the resistance was going to be real. And there would be days when the gap between what a system claimed to value and what it actually did would make her want to pick up the box and walk out again. But she had walked out. She'd carried the box across that lobby, and she'd stood at the front door and the building had shaken, and she'd put the box down and turned around. That was the thing about being the person who stays when it's hard. It doesn't mean you don't feel the door. It means you know the difference between leaving because you should and leaving because you're afraid, and you know which one you're doing. She turned to the first page of the protocol review. She picked up a pen. She started.